I'd like to welcome everyone to the fourth session in our case study from the animal health industry, exploring common legal and risk issues webinar, which we'll be doing. We have had several sessions. We'll have several sessions more. My name is Warren Hamel. I'm a partner here at Venable, and I co-chair our investigations and white-collar defense group. I'm pleased to be joined today by my colleague and good friend, Valerie Cohen. So partner of the commercial litigation group. She'll introduce herself in just a moment. Just wanted to state the occasion today. We will be exploring potential enforcement risks that companies like TriPaw, which is our hypothetical company that we've been using throughout the webinar series, may face as they expand their pharmaceutical and product offerings. The risks range from DEA audits and FDA warning letters to consumer class actions and criminal enforcement. We'll also discuss how to build resilient compliance programs that safeguard innovation while minimizing enforcement exposure. So we invite you to please feel free to submit questions using the Q&A feature. Anytime during the program, we will try to get to all your questions. If for some reason we're not able to do so today, we're happy to follow up individually with you separately. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Valerie for her introduction.
Thanks so much, Warren. I'm delighted to join you and our audience today. I'm a partner at Venable's commercial litigation group, and I also work with Warren and team in the investigations and white-collar space. I have a national healthcare practice where I represent highly regulated healthcare clients, including those in the animal health arena. And the representations span government investigations, enforcement proceedings, and civil and sometimes criminal False Claims Act matters. And while regulatory enforcement in human healthcare is a well-worn path, there is a rising tide of enforcement that we're seeing touch the animal health industry. And we're also seeing animal health enforcement trends often trail human health enforcement trends by a few years. So this is a timely moment to reflect on what we've seen, what we anticipate around the corner, and to hopefully position our animal health practices and business ventures in the best light possible. So back over to you, Warren.
Great. Thank you, Valerie. Just want to give you a little sense of what our agenda is today. I'll be addressing initially animal health criminal enforcement trends. Valerie's going to talk a little bit about the civil litigation trends and potential False Claims Act theories. We do have a couple of additions to our TriPaw hypothetical case study in which we'll ask you all to vote on your views on the potential outcomes. And then we'll spend some time at the end talking about compliance programs and really the most important thing, how to avoid having federal and state enforcement show up at your doorstep. So with that, criminal enforcement trends. A lot of these are probably pretty familiar to you already, but opioids, of course, opioids is has been a matter of intense federal and state criminal enforcement focus for decades, the opioid crisis. FDA has recently warned veterinarians in particular of opioid diversion. In the event you encounter a situation involving opioid diversion or clients seeking opioids under the guise of treating their pets, you should have a safety plan in place, sort of like a suspicious pet owner monitoring system in a way, sort of just keeping an eye out and thinking, is this, have I seen this person too often? Do I know through the grapevine that they're vet shopping? Which is the first bullet point here. One of the things that enforcement agencies are seeing is vet shopping, taking pet to multiple vets to obtain opioids. That has prompted some states to include vets in the prescription drug monitoring programs so they can track it across vet platforms. So you want to make sure that you're understanding what state law requirements are as far as that goes and to obviously participate where required. Pretextual injury, which is something that I can't believe I'm actually saying. I'm a happy owner of a chocolate lab, and it's shocking to me that people would actually do this, but apparently pet owners intentionally harm their animals to obtain painkillers, which I guess is really just a testament to the iron vice grip that opioid addiction can have on certain people. We're going to talk about two other classes of investigations that have appeared recently, one involving xylazine which is a common animal tranquilizer. It's FDA approved only for veterinary use, typically used in large animals. It has sedative, analgesic, and muscle relaxant effects. That kind of puts it right square in the target zone for diversion to human use. And then there's a group of cases involving misbranding and distribution chain integrity, where drugs are being shipped from distribution centers rather than pharmacies, and they're being shipped to locations that are not authorized or licensed under state law. So with that, let's get into the details a little bit more. Of course, the thing about criminal cases, they bring the hammer, and the hammer is there's some fairly serious consequences in both corporate and individual prosecutions. So corporate criminal enforcement matters, it can be via settlement, or heaven forbid you actually go to trial and there's a conviction, but that can involve forfeitures that can be keyed to the total value of the sales involved. There are a lot of different ways to measure that, as we'll see. Fines, criminal fines and penalties, periods of probation, go forward compliance requirements, and even oversight, the most draconian of which, of course, is a corporate monitor. And of course, individuals who are investigated and prosecuted can face incarceration, and some of those periods of incarceration can be pretty significant under the federal sentencing guidelines. So it's serious, and the Department of Justice, FDA, DEA, they take this stuff very seriously. So let's talk a little bit about a xylazine case. This is a very new one, very recent one, January 2026. All Veterinary Supply, Inc. It sold xylazine to two wholesalers in Puerto Rico, which triggered an investigation because their permit did not allow them to sell to other wholesalers. So that just prompted the attention on the part of the DEA and FDA. They were able to trace the xylazine that was coming from AVS into illicit drug supplies in Philadelphia. Xylazine can be sold on its own in illicit drug deals, but it also is often used used to cut other kinds of illicit drugs because it's cheaper and it contains its own kick. ABS pleaded guilty to one count of introduction and delivery of misbranded drugs, that being xylazine, in interstate commerce. There were 3 years of probation, an $18,000 criminal fine, and a forfeiture of $748,000 plus change. Now, the interesting thing to note about this, because there are some different ways to do this, is to figure out what the forfeiture number is. In this case, the government allowed AVS to use the gross profit from the illegal sales, not the value of the sales themselves. So that actually is pretty favorable to the company. That I think results in a lower number, as we'll see. But it's a good illustrator of the fact that if you somehow get caught up in the toils of an investigation, there are a lot of different ways to try and negotiate your way to a more favorable outcome. Second group of cases I want to talk about have to do with the supply chain issues that I just mentioned up front, and that has to do with primarily state laws regulating what kinds of distributions can be made. And of course, in most circumstances, distribution to an end user is going to be from a pharmacy. There are a lot of drug distribution companies that for a while sort of embarked on programs to try and send directly from the distribution centers to end users like ranches and farms, particularly for large animal, because it's just so much more convenient for the vet not to have to store it at their own facility and then stick it in the trunk with ice packs and drive it out to the ranch. That does, in fact, violate in many states state law, along with the other end of those transactions, which is shipping to an unlicensed location. And so it's both. There are two places in the supply chain where it's getting outside of the regulated supply chain that both the federal and the state systems anticipate are going to be there. 2023 resolution with Midwest Veterinary Supply resulted in an $11 million in criminal fines and forfeiture. It was really $10 million plus in forfeiture. and a $500,000 criminal fine. Also, they paid $1 million to the Virginia Department of Health Professions. One thing you should note is that there's a district, a federal district in the far west of Virginia, the Western District of Virginia, that has made a cottage industry out of these cases. And they've got a number of very eager FDA criminal investigators, and they've got a assistant U.S. attorney down there who loves to bring these cases and loves to bring big national companies into Abingdon, Virginia, to do these settlements. And the money's big, and it really is a cottage industry for that particular district. So that's Midwest Veterinary. Before that, in 2020, Animal Health International, AHI, much larger settlement, same kinds of allegations. So sending transactions arising from distribution centers rather than pharmacies and sending to unlicensed locations. One of those locations, funny little fact, was a post office box location called Going Postal. And that got the interest of a couple of FDA criminal investigators because they thought, it just doesn't sound right. And so they did the investigation, and here's the resolution: $46 million in forfeiture, a $1 million payment to the Virginia Department of Health Professionals, a $5 million fine, and a period of probation. And so the thing to note about both of these, both Midwest and AHI, is that in those cases, the forfeiture number was tied not to the profit, but to the total value of the transactions themselves. So it is literally a disgorgement. You got this money in the door, and the federal government's going to force you to pay it back to the federal government. And those numbers get very big very quickly. $46 million. So you put all that together, and that's over a $50 million resolution for animal health. The other thing to note about both AHI and Midwest is that the government did ask them and enforced on them a compliance program, not a full-scale monitorship. Because monitors, as you know, is where they hire a third party. You are forced to hire a third party that's approved by the government. They come into your corporate structure. They reside in your corporate structure. They make sure that your compliance plans are up to snuff, best practices, and what the government's expecting. And they assure that training is happening, that you are actually complying with these compliance plans. It is a very, very robust and very irritating requirement. And fortunately for these two companies, they didn't require a monitor, but they did sort of the next best thing, which is if you look at both of them, there's a fairly detailed compliance program that is imposed on the company. Company is required to certify then over 3 years at the end of each year that it is put the compliance program in place, that it is complying with the program, that it is trained its people. And here's the kicker, that there have been no violations of federal or state law during the period of time covered by the compliance program. You got to certify that under penalty of perjury and under Section 1001, the Federal False Statement Act. So then that puts your CEO and the rest, whoever else in the C-suite is doing the certifications in a very tight spot. You've got to really be careful to make sure you're telling the truth, because that's quite a hammer that the feds will hold over you for the following 3-year period. Also interesting to note that in AHI, because as we know, a lot of corporate structures are fairly complex, and in AHI, the feds actually asked the parent company, Patterson Companies, to enter into a non-prosecution agreement separately with the federal government, which also contained a compliance program similar to what AHI had implemented. So they can pull in lots of different parts of the corporate structure, even if you think, well, that's separate. It's not really implicated in the actual conduct. But the feds like to cast a wide net if they possibly can. So those are some of the things we're seeing in criminal enforcement. Just to kind of quickly recap, obviously financial forfeitures, which can be pegged to a lot of different measures, but the two common ones are profit or just the gross revenues from the transactions that are at issue, federal criminal penalties, period of probation, compliance programs going forward. I've also seen in the opioid for controlled substances, a lot of attention is being paid to make sure that the suspicious order monitoring systems are up to snuff. One way to really think about that, and I know the feds think about it this way, if you are a company that has a fairly high volume CS distribution, and they look back and over the past 5 or 10 years, you've had maybe 5 or 10 reported suspicious transactions. They will look at that and say that seems not like it's consistent with the volume that you're doing. You should be finding more issues, and that alone may prompt them to, step to your front door and ask what's going on. Monitoring, we've already discussed, and I'll just touch on the corporate non-parent, non-prosecution agreements, talked about that. Adverse business impacts, reputational harm, that really doesn't need an explanation. You just don't want to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal with a $46 million forfeiture for misbranded drugs. The other thing in there, I'm going to ask Valerie to talk a little bit, is the downstream state licensure proceedings before we move on to the civil matters.
Thanks, Warren. Yeah, this is an important one to call out because sometimes, understandably, in long-spanning investigations, when we get to a point of resolution, we just want to kind of tie it up in a bow and hopefully move on. But when you're resolving a matter with DOJ, if that's the case, or other federal agencies, be mindful of potential downstream licensure impacts, in particular at the state level. Even if this is not a state case brought against you, the feds will typically say, well, whatever happens in terms of licensure and whatnot, that's not our jurisdiction. So you're kind of, on your own there. Of course, if you have a state body involved in the case in tandem with the feds, maybe there's some room to negotiate that. But be aware that sometimes it could be months or years after a resolution at the federal level, that when it's time for your vet, your clinic to seek recertification or licensure in a new state, or maybe the existing state, or a vet hospital privilege renewal, that a public resolution, like even a DOJ press release, can be caught up or can be triggered in terms of the certification reviews. And you may need to address that with the licensure board. So this is important because if you are negotiating a settlement resolution with whatever agency you're dealing with, think down the line if any state licensure issues might be triggered, what states those are, how active they are in this space. Because while you can't necessarily control it, and it may not necessarily thwart an otherwise appropriate resolution, it's something that is important to advise your client about and be prepared for, and try to wordsmith around it to the extent you can in your resolution, and to the extent you have ability to opine on the public-facing press release.
Yeah, and I just want to emphasize what Valerie's point is there. We did a kind of a 50-state survey on some of these prior resolutions, AHI and Midwest, and there's not been a huge amount of pharma board activity, but there have been the occasional pharma board that has said, I think, for instance, Alabama, in one instance, when the recertification came up for the pharma certification or licensure, Alabama said, you got to come down and you got to make a presentation. And by the way, we're going to want $20,000 in terms of a fine before we're going to re-up your license. I think that's going to become more prevalent as pharma boards kind of see the opportunity for what is in essence free money. So I think that's it's an important thing to keep an eye out for in the future, as Valerie likes to say, around the corner. So, all right, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Valerie for civil litigation trends.
Great. Well, while certainly avoiding criminal exposure is of the utmost importance, civil litigation and civil investigations can be extremely disruptive and very costly. And sometimes both can proceed at the same time, civil and criminal. So we're going to focus on civil litigation for the next moments here. And the private civil litigation space can be a follow-on to a regulatory enforcement matter, or it can be in reaction to a negative media headline. But the reverse also may be true, where you can have a whistleblower raise an issue that can prompt media attention, depending on where the whistleblower goes with that issue, as well as regulatory investigations. So let's talk about some trends that are driving some recent civil litigation and enforcement. So you'll see up there humanization of pet care. So you would have had to live without internet probably for the last 5-10 years to not at least have some awareness of the human wellness trends that are quite big right now. And as noted earlier, the what we've seen is animal health trends often tracking human health trends by a couple of years or a few years, and we've seen the same thing here. So there are a number of pet products that look to give our pets more nutrition. Maybe that's through vitamin supplements, raw diets, certain SSRIs are becoming more prevalent in the animal health pet space in particular. So there's been, someone asked me a few months back, why are all dogs on Prozac now? And I said, oh, I was so jarred by that. But in fact, if if your own pet isn't on it, if you speak to others, particularly those who live in urban settings, I live in New York City myself, and there's a big movement around, well, a lot of anxious pets here, a lot of activity, a lot of things that can trigger them. So this is an effort to keep them more calm. Along those same lines, CBD treats and chews are becoming popular in the animal health space. Vet formulated meal toppers. There's a number of products out there. In addition, in terms of physical wellness, there are health monitoring apps for pets, often on collars, that you can track how many steps they've taken, if maybe they're more lethargic than you think they should be. So very much tracking some of these human products. And so while for many folks this is great and a real advancement in terms of pet care and pet oversight, unsurprisingly, they've also triggered some new litigation matters and theories. And while all in tandem with what I've just described, we've seen media reports and interviews of vets and whatnot observing rising vaccine hesitancy among some pet owners who are maybe a little gun shy in getting that annual vaccine, and speaking to their vets about it. So a lot of activity on this animal health space, also in the tech side, where we are seeing animal health diagnostics and health monitoring devices integrate AI and other technologies. And of course, that too poses some new areas of risk if unexpected things crop up. And of course, telemedicine, something that became really, really important and mushroomed during the COVID era, is also expanding into animal health for convenience reasons. And we'll talk more about some examples about that. So we'll move on to the next slide to talk about some recent examples of these types of litigation. So, and I will footnote that we do have a deeper dive on products liability matters in particular in a couple of months with our Venable products liability gurus. So May 20th, tune in if this little teaser gets you interested. They're going to do a deeper dive on animal health products liability litigations and how to hopefully avoid some of the pitfalls. So let's talk about some examples. So I'll actually start in reverse from this slide and talk about some of the consumer class actions. So in the antitrust space, there's been a number of settlements or settling defendants in an antitrust consumer class action that alleges that Elanco Animal Health, which is a global animal health pharmaceutical company, paid pet supply retailers incentives or rebates conditioned on not stocking generic versions of a topical flea and tick product, a prevention product. And the allegation is that this unlawfully restrained competition. And over the last couple of months, just in 2026 alone, we've got a number of additional parties settling these cases, including names everybody's heard of, probably Chewy, Elanco, PetMed. Um, and there's still a couple of retailers in the litigation that haven't settled, like Petco and PetSmart, but we'll see where the case goes. But what's interesting about it is that these cases, and there were a number of them, they were brought under the federal and state antitrust laws. Although in at least one of those cases, the court dismissed the federal Sherman Act damages claims while permitting the state law claims to go forward. So another area where the combination of federal and state laws is important and relevant to keep track of. So switching to a different type of class action in the products liability space, failure to warn space, just last year, final approval was given to a $15 million or so settlement that resolved allegations without any admission of wrongdoing that the Seresto flea and tick collars caused pet injuries and deaths primarily through toxicity from the active ingredient in those collars, and in some cases, the collar's mechanical failure. And so no admission of wrongdoing, and the core allegation there was that defendants failed to provide adequate warning about these potential risks. So very, very, very bread and butter theories of products liability here that led to a sizable resolution. And with the influx of additional animal health, animal tracking, all these products, just be aware of the disclaimers that are being put on those products. And we now have some precedent to look at in terms of what the allegations can be. And then let me talk about the tech space, if you will. So there was a lawsuit filed earlier this year in state court in Los Angeles. It was actually recently transferred to federal court in the Central District of California. But the crux of the allegations there are that the two LA-based vet clinics, they filed a lawsuit alleging that a diagnostics pet healthcare company fraudulently concealed a software algorithm defect that allegedly led to the death of 40 dogs and hundreds of animals getting sick or missing treatment because of false diagnostic testing results. So this is one to watch. There's actually a number of related cases now pending on this issue in the federal court in California. And so again, with the rise of AI and other tech, just beware that if you're in a compliance legal function, that those products are sufficiently vetted and have whatever disclaimers are appropriate, and vendors and suppliers are doing their part to give you assurance of the efficacy of these products. Okay, we can move on to the next slide here. So we talked about how about actual kind of ongoing real life matters cases in the civil litigation realm. We wanted to address a potential rising tide in the False Claims Act space. Traditionally, the False Claims Act, which I'll describe in a moment, it wasn't used to prosecute the kind of animal health wellness issues the way that it's very popular in human health, where Medicare, Medicaid, a lot of government funds are used to provide and reimburse for human health care. We don't see that in the animal health space, with the caveat of military canines that are active duty, that their healthcare actually, understandably, of course, is covered by the Department of Defense funding. But apart from that, we don't think of the False Claims Act as particularly meaningful certainly in the animal pet health space. However, we wanted to address it because we've seen novel uses of the False Claims Act over the last year, and we see more opportunity for it in the animal health space. So if we'll go to the next slide, we'll dive right in. But before I do, let me give our listeners, we're exactly at the 30-minute mark, halfway through. So let me give our listeners our CLE code, and we'll do it again at the end of our presentation. So our CLE code is Enforcement 2026. All one word, Enforcement 2026. And for those that are wondering, do I capitalize? Do I lowercase? I don't think it matters, but we have it as a capital E, but the rest lowercase, 2026, no spaces. Okay, so perhaps there are a couple of folks out there that are False Claims Act gurus, but for those who are not, let me give you a little primer on what is the False Claims Act. It is a federal statute. It's been around a really long time, since the Civil War days, and it imposes liability on any person who knowingly submits or causes the submission of false claims for government payment. It also is triggered when someone makes a false statement that is material to the government's payment decision. And it also is triggered if somebody improperly avoids obligations owed to the government. So essentially has a debt that they have to repay and they don't repay it. So this is a big deal because anybody who contracts with the government is subject to the False Claims Act. It is mostly used as a civil liability statute, but it does have a criminal provision that can be triggered sometimes. The consequences of violating the False Claims Act are really severe, financially speaking. The government, if they prove their case, they can collect, actually, it's mandatorily required that they collect treble damages. So if the government paid $10 million for claims that it was determined turned out to be false, then that number is multiplied by 3. So 10 million becomes 30 million off the bat. And sometimes even worse is the penalties that can be added on top of that. So depending on the date of the violation, the civil monetary penalties that are tacked on range, like for example, these days for violations over the last year or so, they range from about 14,000 to 29,000 per false claim. And so if you're dealing with prescription drugs, for instance, and the false claim is each submission that was reimbursed by the government, and it's over a 5+ year span, I mean, you can have 100,000 or more submissions, and if each one is in fact a false claim, you multiply that 100,000 by 15,000, 29,000, depending on where you fall in that range. So the numbers can really, really pop. And in certain circumstances, you can have exclusion from government health programs. Again, not a typical area for animal health in terms of healthcare reimbursement, but we'll talk about how it can come into play. And then the other really, really important thing about the False Claims Act and what makes it very potent is that it has a qui tam provision, which allows private individuals to stand in the government's shoes and bring a False Claims Act action to redress harm to the government. So if a whistleblower says, you know what, I believe that $10 million grant that the Department of Agriculture paid out to my company, that those funds were misused. They weren't used for the purposes that the federal agency granted it. And so I'm going to report this to regulators. And if that relator, we call a whistleblower relator in the False Claims Act context, prevails, they can earn about 10 to 30% of the government's recovery, if there is a recovery, and that includes settlements. So a lot of incentives for those for certain folks to look to the whistleblower provisions. Okay. And most states, by the way, speaking of continuing the thread of federal versus state, they also have their own False Claims Act. It often mirrors the federal False Claims Act. And state False Claims Acts can come into play when state funds are procured through state grants. And sometimes there are combo cases where you have the federal regulators and the state regulators pursuing a false act case in tandem where there's both federal and state funds involved. Okay, so let's now talk about an example, like an example where the False Claims Act was triggered in, well, I'll admit, is an adjacent animal health matter. It's not what I would call a tried and true one, but it involves a big settlement by Duke University about 7 years ago now that involved lab studies that relied on mouse studies that were allegedly falsified. So let's talk about it and how this can be relevant to the work that perhaps some do in the animal health space. So in March of 2019, Duke University agreed to pay $112+ million to resolve allegations that over a 12-year period, 2006 to 2018, it knowingly submitted claims to the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, that included falsified data in connection with federally funded research grant. And the core allegations by the government was that the certain research results that were submitted involving mouse studies that were conducted by a tech at a Duke lab were fabricated or falsified, and that those results were submitted in 30 different grant applications and progress reports, causing these two agencies, NIH and EPA, to award grant funds that they otherwise would not have. And the settlement was, really big, over $100 million. It resolved DOJ's allegations as well as a key TAM suit, this whistleblower suit that had first been filed under seal in 2013. And what's interesting, initially DOJ declined to intervene in it, but then ultimately intervened for purposes of settlement, and they got this global resolution. And so the takeaway is be really mindful of the grants that are being applied for, that are being renewed, because if they involve federal funds and also state funds, there's typically some language in them that requires certifying compliance with a number of laws at the risk of violating the False Claims Act or other statutes. So even if it seems like a remote concern, it's always worthwhile to look at the language of the grant application or the grant award and make sure that what you're certifying to is within the bounds of comfort. So we can move on to the next slide. Oh yeah, so this one just touches on for those who are very interested in this Duke settlement, it encompassed these four really core False Claims Act theories. So for the False Claims Act geeks out there, you can look into it. It's a good one. We can move on to the next slide. Okay, so what are some kind of practical risk mitigation tips here? So if you're applying for government funded grants to support research involving animal health or involving animal study, beware that misrepresentations, falsified research, or compliance certifications, if you have no reason to doubt that, great. But if you've been put on notice of non-compliance in some way, don't just ignore those provisions, because there's things you can do to try to mitigate that risk without giving up the application or the grant. And just as an example of one thing that is commonly asked to certify, so certify compliance with animal cruelty and related laws. This is an issue that came up not that long ago in a PPP loan application that was submitted during the COVID timeframe. And it turns out that the individual and entity that submitted it was in fact, or at least as the allegations bore out, discovered to have been breeding and feeding animals in very unsanitary and cruel conditions, and that led to a False Claims Act action. And so that's just one example of how the False Claims Act can tie into animal health issues. Also consider making, if you feel like maybe you're in the midst of an active investigation, maybe you're being audited or investigated by an external party, and it's not just an internal kind of concern that you're vetting. This is a good area to consult with your in-house legal team, and if need be, outside counsel, because there may be reason to make a qualified certification or a qualified attestation. This is an art, not a science. So, if you're ever in that position of we can't not apply or renew this application, but we want to be truthful and we want to be transparent, definitely an area to talk to counsel about how to navigate that delicate balance. Also consider if you're working with, if you have a deep organization with lots of layers, or maybe you've got vendors or subcontractors, consider obtaining compliance sub-attestations that, again, can try to build that good faith narrative story that you did what was reasonable and appropriate to comply with the certifications you were making. And if you do receive a report of concerns over misuse of federal funds or state funds, have a system that can intake those concerns, uh, address them. Not every concern is equal in terms of scope and accuracy, but don't ignore it and don't issue a conclusory no. This makes no sense. So you should look into it, commensurate to the reported concern, and you should document it so that there's a paper trail of what you did to respond, and follow up and close the loop. And many times the concern is unsubstantiated, or maybe it's an employee gripe that's really a personal one in nature and not having to do with the merits of funding or and things like that. But don't short circuit it, because it can come back to haunt you, and it can also cause somebody who could otherwise be whose concerns could otherwise be allayed internally to turn into a whistleblower and to cause a lot of disruption to the company if the regulator comes knocking on your door to investigate. So with that, I will turn it back over to Warren to get some audience participation in our TriPaw animal health hypotheticals.
Great, thanks, Valerie. I don't know how many of you all have been in our prior webinars. We do have a TriPaw company hypothetical that we've kind of built out over the webinar series and will continue to build out. It's a hypothetical company that is in the animal health sphere. It's in nutrition, it's in animal care. It has its own veterinary practices, therapeutics, so pharmaceuticals, etc. It's kind of everything in the animal health sphere that you could imagine under one roof. Um, and just to kind of revisit, it's a diversified animal healthcare company delivering science-backed solutions that support the full spectrum of animal wellness, from nutrition to everyday care to veterinary service and prescription therapeutics, serves pets and their people with innovation and integrity. TriPaw is growing. And as it grows, so grows the enforcement risks. As it expands into prescription drugs, biologics, wellness products that Valerie mentioned, and direct-to-consumer channels. So we're going to have three hypothetical examples that Valerie's going to walk us through, and we have a voting window that will should pop up in your screen. So we encourage you to participate and give us your views on what the answers are to these to each of these hypos. Please vote. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Warren. Okay, so you should all see a scenario, our first TriPaw scenario. So this one involves children's over-the-counter medication. A veterinarian at TriPaw's veterinary clinic recommends children's over-the-counter medicine for a pet dog's fever. Does this raise potential concerns under A, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, B, the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act, or AMDUCA, C, both, or D, neither? We'll give our audience a moment to think about it, put in your votes. But what do you think? Are any of these triggered? Not violated, but triggered. And we'll talk about the difference.
Unfortunately, we don't get to vote.
Yeah, we don't get to vote, but that's only fair, I would say, Warren. There's no wrong answers, generally speaking. All right, just waiting for our calculations. Okay, so the report is that the predominant answer was C, both. both the FDCA and AMDUCA are triggered. And good news, our audience members are correct, those that voted for C. It is true that both are triggered, and that's because extra label use of a human drug in animals is governed by AMDUCA, the Animal Medicinal Drug Use Clarification Act of 1994. And that act operates within the FDCA framework. So let me unpack that for a moment. So the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, FDCA, gives the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, authority to regulate human and animal drugs, medical devices, food, which includes pet foods and supplements, and cosmetics. That's maybe the next terrain of animal products. But anyway, in the animal health context, there's no question that the FDCA governs, and the approval of new animal drugs, misbranding or adulteration concerns, veterinary drug compounding, distribution, drug labeling, that's all under the auspices of the FDCA. And so when it comes to extra label use of a human over-the-counter drug in animals, that can render the drug, at least optically, quote unquote, unsafe under the FCA unless the use complies with AMDUCA and the implementing regulations under it. And that importantly includes a valid VCPR, which we're going to talk more about, the veterinary client pet relationship, really foundational to a lot of these scenarios. And it also requires clinical necessity and record keeping. So what exactly is AMDUCA? So at its core, it legalizes the extra label use of approved animal or human drugs in animals under certain conditions, but it has to be under the order of a licensed vet with an established VCPR being the key requirement among some others. Okay, so now we've conquered that one. Let's go to our next scenario, telemedicine. So like any good company trying to stay abreast of the latest trends, TriPaw has expanded its clinical offerings to telehealth veterinary care. And we have a vet who's licensed only in New York that is treating via telehealth a pet located in Florida. Does this raise potential concerns under A, state licensure laws, B, veterinarian client-patient relationship, VCPR, C, Drug Enforcement Agency registration, or DEA, or D, all of the above? Let's give our audience members a moment to think about it and respond. Which of these trigger concerns? Okay, this was a landslide nearly. It seems like nearly everybody voted for D, all, that this raises potential concerns under all three, state licensure laws, VCPR, and DEA registration. So that's correct. That's right. You're catching on, our smart audience members. So let's touch on each. So DEA registration. Under the Controlled Substances Act, any practitioner who dispenses, administers, or prescribes controlled substances must have a federal DEA registration. Now, our scenario, we didn't tell you what happened during the telemedicine visit, right? We didn't say, oh, and the vet prescribed a prescription drug. But if the vet did, then it is possible that well, first of all, it is possible that that could have happened, right? And in which case it would have triggered this concern over DEA registration. So importantly, DEA registrations are issued per state of practice. So if a vet practices in multiple states and prescribes and dispenses controlled substances in each of those states, then generally a separate DEA registration is required for each state. Separate from DEA registration is state registration. What we have here is the state licensure law option. So in addition, most states require a state controlled substances registration, a state veterinary license, and or compliance with state prescription monitoring programs, PDMPs. and failure to comply might result in state board discipline that is independent of federal enforcement. Again, that interplay of federal and state, very important and active in the animal health space. So well done. Let's close out with our third and final scenario. Next slide, please. Okay, there we go. Okay, so our federal rural grant scenario. So TriPaw, Go TriPaw, has received $1 million federal grant to open veterinary clinics for retired military working dogs. Those are our retired canines in remote rural locations. A TriPaw employee at one of the clinics has emailed the hashtag TriPaw compliance email address reporting concerns that some of the grant funds are being used for the annual vet office holiday party. Does this raise potential concerns under the False Claims Act? A, yes. B, no. C, maybe. Again, we'll give our audience a moment to vote. This will test the knowledge of those who are listening to the False Claims Act portion of the presentation. All right, let's see what we got. Okay, so 67% of voters said yes, it does raise concerns under the False Claims Act. So that's, and 33% voted maybe, C. And it seems like nobody voted no, so well done. Well, good listening, audience. I think the most correct answer is C, maybe. And let me explain that. So liability could arise in at least two ways under the False Claims Act in this scenario. First, there may be a misuse of government funds if the terms of the grant disallow funds for office expenses outside of clinical care for these retired canines. So very, very important to check the terms of your grant. There's not kind of like a bright line rule of, oh, that these grants only would ever cover the clinical side. It could be that there is maybe 10% set aside for office administrative functions. And then the question becomes, well, is a holiday party an admin function? So, this is a good one to work through with your legal counsel. But either way, the concern should prompt an acknowledgement of the email, a review that you typically would want to involve legal to preserve confidentiality, to preserve the privileged nature of the review, as well as a substantive response ultimately to the person that reported the concern. You want to close that loop and have a record that shows you did that. The other possible concern here is a whistleblower risk. So if a response is not taken seriously and investigated, you may have what could have been, like a good faith concern being reported. You could have somebody that feels like they weren't taken seriously and they may look to hire a whistleblower counsel or go straight to the regulator and file a qui tam lawsuit. And even if this is very important for those who work in organizations where there's some risk of concerns along these lines coming up, even if the merits of the allegations are ultimately incorrect or unsubstantiated, like let's say there is an explicit carve out that sets aside funds for holiday parties, and so there's actually no violation of the grant terms in this hypo, but because the company, let's say, taking a step further, they said to this whistleblower, or the employee reporting the concerns, they said, hey, you got to stop with that. Like, you shouldn't be snooping around and raising these issues. That's not your job. And, as a result, like we're demoting you to this position, or they fire the person. in that scenario, even if the merits don't violate the False Claims Act, there is a standalone retaliation provision of the False Claims Act that protects whistleblowers. So in other words, this person could bring a False Claims Act case for retaliation, saying I was retaliated against for exercising my right to report this concern, and they may prevail on that even if the merits of the False Claims Act case are dismissed. So we've gone through our three scenarios. Well done. Let me toss it back to Warren to close out with some important compliance tips.
Yeah, thanks, Valerie. We'll take the remaining time we have. May take a minute or two over our hour, but just talk a little bit about compliance pro tips. And a lot of these are probably pretty obvious from some of the things we've said in terms of what the enforcement uh, landscape looks like. Developing a corporate culture of compliance is both a keystone of staying on the right side of the law. It's also one of the most difficult things to do, particularly if there has been any issue, over time. I know a lot of times internally, for instance, there'll be tension between the sales force and compliance and legal about how close to get to the edge of the envelope. And compliance legal don't want to get anywhere near that edge, and sales wants to push sales. And so you really do have to really from the top, the C-suite from all the way down, sort of make some very basic fundamental decisions about how you want to approach compliance, and then weave that into the culture along with some of the specifics we're going to talk about here. So obviously having a robust compliance program in place and then doing employee and vendor training. The suspicious order monitoring system, that's an area that DEA is spending a lot of time looking at these days. There's a lot of software systems out there that I'm aware of that companies are taking on board to use to kind of, supercharge their SOM process. So you want to, again, be careful. That I think Valerie's software case makes clear you want to be careful about the kinds of things you're bringing on board. Self-audits. Auditing is, a really important part. Government's going to want to know, well, okay, you've got these great policies, you've done the training. How do you know it's working? The way you know it's working or not working is through auditing. Treat animal health like regulated pharma. I think that's kind of our overall message here is, to some extent, I think we both think that the animal health, sort of sector has kind of thought, well, we're kind of over here and no one's really paying attention to us. But I think those days really are coming to an end, and you really have to treat the animal health sector just like human health. It's all the same compliance issues, and it's all the same enforcement and other potential risks. State regulatory license reviews. An important piece Valerie sort of touched on. It's the kind of thing that can bite you down the road if you do have an enforcement matter. And then here, I think this might be our last substantive slide, and that's just a quick checklist. So building a compliance infrastructure proportionate to regulatory exposure. I've worked with clients who are in year 5 of revising their compliance structure. Please don't get yourself into that position. Just, make the commitment as an organization. Bring in consultants if you need to, but get compliance up to best practices as quickly as possible. That's the way to avoid an enforcement Donnybrook. You want to protect your distribution chain. Those cases down in Western District of Virginia, I think, highlight that. Document your extra-legal use. I think documentation is another theme, another through line for us here. We've talked about documenting your investigation into an internal whistleblower. You want to document, so that if the feds or the state does come calling, you can say, well, yeah, we did look at this and look at how thorough a job we did. Managing telemedicine expansion. That's going to obviously get you into whatever states your telemedicine expansion is going to take place. This is something we really haven't talked about very much, but scrutinizing your rebate and exclusivity programs for antitrust issues. You want to substantiate marketing claims. That's in the product liabilities side, evaluate grant certifications against False Claims Act risk. I honestly think that the largest sort of sphere of that is going to be Department of Agriculture grants. They some often flow down through the states, but there's still federal dollars. And so you can be getting state money, quote unquote, but if it's ultimately funded by the feds can still come after you under a False Claims Act, federal False Claims Act. You want to be careful with gifts and entertainment policies. You want to validate diagnostic software and obviously maintain a cross-functional compliance culture. So I think we have made our way with 1 minute over our time. And so any questions?
I will acknowledge we did get a question from the chat about, well, the telemedicine hypothetical, and well, what if a pet owner lives in Florida and the vet's in New York, but the pet owner is on vacation in California? And these are real life scenarios. So what we can say is the responses to these scenarios are very state specific. Often, not always, but often state laws base the licensure requirement on the state where the patient is physically located at the time of the visit. And so that can, be a real hindrance, right, to receiving care from your go-to vet if they're not licensed in that state. So, but we can handle any one-on-one questions after the webinar. Otherwise, we thank you all so much for joining and staying with us these extra 2 minutes. The CLE code is Enforcement 2026. No spaces, Enforcement 2026.
And we hope you'll join us for the next webinar in the series, Deals and Dollars, Transactions and Financing in Animal Health. That'll take place on April 16th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern. And we look forward to seeing you then. And again, thank you so much for spending your time with us today. We enjoyed it. Hope you did too.